Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Monday, February 24th, 2025. All right, first thing I need to go over today is sort of a clarification or a correction from the last episode of this show. I covered this order that Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth gave to the Pentagon, and the way it was initially reported by the Washington Post was that he was ordering an 8% cut to Pentagon spending over the next 5 years, every year for 5 years. Well, it turns out that was a complete misrepresentation of the actual order that he gave. And I apologize for taking the Washington Post's word for it. It did sound a little too good to be true. It turns out the whole thing is just a redirection of spending, and they're not actually going to cut any spending at all. And in fact, it looks like they're probably going to increase military spending. So this was cleared up initially by Acting Deputy Secretary of Defense Robert G. Salasys. He put out a statement after this Washington Post report that said the idea is to redirect military spending and not actually make cuts to the budget. So again, the Washington Post initially said Hegseth ordered an 8% cut, saying cut it, get rid of it. But essentially what they're doing is finding areas where they can cut spending and then redirect it into spending priorities of the Trump administration. So this is Salasys, the acting Deputy Secretary of Defense. He said, quote, "The department will develop a list of potential offsets that could be used to fund these priorities, as well as to refocus the department on its core mission of deterring and winning wars. The offsets are targeted at 8% of the Biden administration's fiscal year 2026 budget, totaling around $50 billion, which will then be spent on programs aligned with President Trump's priorities," end quote. And then the next day, Hegseth himself put out a statement saying that the Trump administration would be taking $50 billion away from, quote, "woke Biden-era non-lethal programs and instead spend that money on President Trump's America First, Peace Through Strength priorities," end quote. Hegseth criticized the Washington Post for reporting, misrepresenting the memo that he issued. He said the memo was clear in what it said, but again, they completely... I guess maybe they thought it would make him look bad if he was ordering actual cuts to the military budget. Meanwhile, most people were actually get excited about that sort of thing. And Hegseth also said in his statement that he wants the biggest, most badass military on the planet. So again, just none of this is encouraging here. And then the Deputy Secretary of Defense said one of the spending priorities of this new Trump administration is this so-called Iron Dome for America, this big new missile defense system that Trump wants. That's going to come with a huge price tag, going to be a total boondoggle to the weapons makers, and it's going to start a new arms race. It's just a really bad idea. So this story went from very good sounding to very bad sounding. And Trump also backed this budget plan from House Republicans that will increase military spending by $100 billion. So again, sorry that I covered that. I didn't, I got too excited. I should have realized that it was too good to be true before I wrote that up and did the show on it. But anyway, so now to get into today's page, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today, 40,000 West Bank Palestinians cannot return home. So Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz said Sunday that the Israeli military has forcibly displaced 40,000 Palestinians in the northern occupied West Bank and said that they could not return home as the IDF will be operating in the area over the next year. So this is a huge statement to see from the Israeli defense minister, basically saying, yes, we forcibly displaced this people and they can't go back. This is kind of a sign of these new tactics that they're doing in the West Bank, similar to what they did in Gaza. So the Israeli military launched the current operation in the West Bank, dubbed Iron Wall, on January 21st. It has been focused on the northern cities of Jenin and Tulkarem, but has spread elsewhere in the occupied territory. In a new escalation, Israeli tanks entered the West Bank on Sunday for the first time since 2002. Katz said in a statement that he ordered the Israeli military to, quote, prepare for an extended stay in the camps that have been cleared for the coming year and not to allow residents to return. We will not return to the reality that existed in the past. We will continue to clear refugee camps and other terrorist centers in order to dismantle the battalions and terrorist infrastructures of extremist Islam that were built, end quote. The tank deployment into the West Bank came after Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu ordered an escalation in the occupied territory following the bombing of empty buses in the Israeli city of Bat Yam near Tel Aviv. So there was this bus bombing. What did this happen? Thursday, and the buses were empty. Nobody was hurt or killed. Israeli officials blamed the West Bank resistance groups. There was a note left at the scene that said revenge from Tulkaram, but things appear not to be what they seem here because the Shin Bet, the Israeli security agency, arrested 2 Jewish Israelis for alleged involvement in the attack. And now there's been, we haven't heard any more information about, the plot or the attack since then. So they use this as an escalation, as an excuse to escalate in the West Bank. But it turns out, again, things are not what they claimed. So according to the UN, more than 50 Palestinians have been killed by Israeli forces in the West Bank since the new operation was launched last month. The dead include many civilians and children as the Israeli military expanded an open fire order in the occupied territory. On Friday, 2 Palestinian children were shot and killed by Israeli troops in the West Bank. Rimas al-Amori, a 13-year-old girl, was shot in the back while standing in the courtyard of her family home in Jenin. Ayman Nasser Taiser al-Hamoini, a 12-year-old boy, was also shot in the back while standing near the home of a family member in the southern West Bank city of Hebron. So again, this has spread across the West Bank. And both of these children were shot in the back by Israeli soldiers who were in armored vehicles. And this is just another day. Israel just murdering more children. It's barely newsworthy in the Western and U.S. media. And Israel's escalations in the West Bank have also involved the destruction of infrastructure, including roads and homes, mirroring the strategies of the IDF in Gaza. When the Iron Wall was first launched, Katz said that the Israeli military was applying lessons that it had learned in Gaza. All right, so the next one here, Hamas says Israel's delay is a blatant violation of the ceasefire deal. So on Sunday, Hamas responded to Israel's decision to delay the release of more than 600 Palestinians from Israeli jails as a blatant violation of the hostage and ceasefire deal. So over the weekend, Hamas released 6 Israeli hostages, and in exchange, Israel was supposed to release 620 Palestinians from Israeli jails. And this included many women and children who were arrested in Gaza after October 7th. On no charges, just rounded up and thrown in a cage. And now Israel is delaying these releases. Netanyahu alleged that it was over Hamas ceasefire violations, but there's been no real ceasefire violations from Hamas at all. What Netanyahu really did this over, and he said this in his statement, was these handover ceremonies that Hamas has been doing, where they kind of take the hostage out, put them on stage, and make them wave and everything. There was one Israeli IDF soldier who looked particularly happy. I'm sure a lot of you saw there was a video of him kissing 2 Hamas fighters on the head. And I think that's probably the reason why, one of the reasons why Netanyahu decided to do this. But this is, really throws the whole ceasefire deal, hostage deal into question. In response to Israel delaying these releases, Hamas official Azat al-Rashk said that Netanyahu's decision, quote, reflects a deliberate attempt to disrupt the agreement, represents a blatant violation of its terms, and shows the occupation's lack of reliability in implementing its obligations, end quote. Israel has repeatedly violated the ceasefire deal, including by continuing to shoot and bomb Palestinians in Gaza. As we've covered on the show, more than 100 Palestinians have been killed in Gaza since January 19th. I mean, think about how many that is in the West Bank, where there's been this big military escalation. they've killed around 50 Palestinians. Well, in Gaza, where there's supposedly a ceasefire, they've killed more than 100. And then the Israelis are claiming Hamas is the one violating the ceasefire. And this is a big, not releasing these prisoners, these Palestinians in Israeli jails, you could call them hostages as well. Not releasing them is a violation, a huge violation of the ceasefire. And Netanyahu said that the release of these 620 Palestinians was delayed until the release of the next hostages has been assured. And he said, and with no ceremonies, he doesn't want the ceremonies to happen anymore. So the problem is that these 6 Israeli hostages that Hamas released, they were the last surviving hostages to be released under the first phase of the ceasefire deal. And there's no agreement yet on the second phase. So there's no timeline here when the next Israeli hostages will be released. And Hamas is also saying that there's going to be no talks on the second phase on continuing the deal until Israel releases these Palestinians that it committed to releasing. So again, this just throws the whole deal, the negotiations, into question here. And it's been really shaky as it's been. And Netanyahu has also been warning that he's ready to restart Israel's genocidal war on Gaza, a threat that he repeated on Sunday. He said, quote, "We are prepared to resume intense fighting at any moment. In Gaza, we have eliminated most of Hamas's organized forces, but let there be no doubt, we will complete the war's objectives entirely, whether through negotiations or by other means," end quote. So the next one here, Trump envoy says that Hamas must physically leave Gaza. So this one is from Kyle Anzalone at the Libertarian Institute. So the U.S. and Israel continue to manipulate the conditions of Israel's ceasefire and hostage deal with Hamas. Donald Trump's Middle East envoy, Steve Witkoff, now says for the agreement to continue, members of Hamas must physically leave Gaza. And this is the U.S. basically backing these new demands from Netanyahu. We saw last week Israeli media reported that Netanyahu added the new demands for the second phase, including Hamas leaving Gaza and being disarmed. So on CBS's Face the Nation, Witkoff said, quote, "Netanyahu said what the red line is, and that is that Hamas cannot be involved in governing when this thing is resolved. A permanent ceasefire, a cessation of all violence, and in addition to that, the fact that Hamas cannot be allowed to come back into the government. And I think the way you square that circle is that Hamas has to go. They've got to leave physically," end quote. So again, just another thing amid these shaky negotiations, this shaky deal, just not a good sign that the full thing's going to be implemented. All right, so the next one here, Netanyahu says no Syrian forces south of Damascus. So Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu declared on Sunday that Israel would not allow any Syrian forces to be in areas south of Damascus, and said the Israeli occupation of southern Syria would continue for an unlimited period of time. Netanyahu said, quote, "Take note, we will not allow HTS forces or the new Syrian army to enter the area south of Damascus," end quote. So quite the statement here from Netanyahu. Israel has been they've been occupying the Golan Heights in Syria for many decades. But then after the regime change in Syria, they captured more territory, captured a buffer zone, and they pushed further in. And they're occupying a pretty decent chunk of Syrian territory. And now Netanyahu's saying there can't be any sort of military force south of Damascus in a very huge swath of Syria. He continued, quote, "We demand the complete demilitarization of southern Syria in the provinces of Quneitra, Dara, and Suwaida from the forces of the new regime. Likewise, we will not tolerate any threat to the Druze community in southern Syria," end quote. So, again, I mention this a lot when we talk about what Israel's been up to in Syria, but they helped with the regime change. They bombed the Assad government for years and years and years. And they really ramped up the bombings in the weeks leading up to the HTS offensive. When Assad was overthrown, Netanyahu came out and took credit for it. He said, "This is because of us. We defeated the Iranian Axis in Syria, but also, we don't like these new guys either, so we're going to have to bomb them and take territory in Syria now." So, and now it seems like they're trying to make an enemy out of this new HTS-led Al-Qaeda-linked government. And part of this declaration could be to keep the U.S., involved and keep the U.S. hostile toward Syria. So the whole thing is just a mess in Syria, and Israel's also been establishing these outposts in southern Syria that essentially are permanent military outposts. So then they're continuing to push. We see stories of them pushing into different villages, and they're they have no plans to leave, and I think that's very clear now. All right, so the next one here, latest U.S. strike killed the brother of a Syrian government minister. So this article is from Jason Ditz. So the U.S. has continued carrying out airstrikes against Syria's Idlib province in northwest Syria. And they targeted and killed a guy named Wasim Tassin Bayraktar. That's his last name. And they described him as a senior leadership facilitator for the Al-Qaeda-linked Haras al-Din, which is different than HTS. They were the same group at one point. All these groups split up and different people joined different groups. But anyway, so this is the third known U.S. drone strike in the Idlib province under President Trump, under his new administration. So this is kind of a continued thing. This is a drone war that Trump is fighting now in northwest Syria. And so the whole thing is really, it's confusing to try to follow this. So I mentioned this is Haras al-Din, and they were an offshoot of HTS, which is the faction that controls Syria now. And HTS is an offshoot of Al-Qaeda in Syria. And Haras al-Din was like the official Al-Qaeda affiliate, while HTS tried to kind of rebrand. But just before the U.S. started launching these drone strikes, Haras al-Din announced that it was dissolving, saying that its goals were completed in Syria after the regime change of Assad. It goes to show who was on the U.S.'s side in Syria. So Haras al-Din said it was dissolving, and now the U.S. keeps saying that they're targeting them. They're targeting these Haras al-Din guys. And so, what exactly is the structure of this group? Did they really dissolve? Do they really exist at all? Are they trying to merge into HTS? But the interesting part of this drone strike is that this guy, Bayraktar, is the brother of Samer Bayraktar, who is a Syrian government minister, a minister in the new HTS-led government. He's the religious endowments minister, and this ministry ensures that endowments are used properly for the maintaining of mosques and to help pay for religious education. So not a surprise that you get a Haras al-Din guy and an HTS guy who are related, since they're both these Al-Qaeda jihadist groups. But there's also a Syrian researcher who is saying that this man who the U.S. killed, actually left Haras al-Din 5 years ago. So that goes against the U.S. claim that he was some sort of senior Haras al-Din facilitator. And this is always what happens with the drone wars. Things are very murky. The U.S. could have bad intelligence, they kill innocent people all the time. And there's so much you don't know when you're operating from a flying robot in the sky, basically. And it looks like the U.S. is not letting up on these drone strikes. There was another one reported on Sunday that was likely a U.S. strike. The U.S. hasn't officially taken credit for that, and the details aren't exactly clear of who was killed in that. But this is just a shadow war that seems to be getting very little coverage. And, again, the whole situation in Syria is just such a mess. There's no reason for the U.S. to be involved, for the U.S. to be bombing Syria, for the U.S. to continue occupying eastern Syria. All right, so the next one here, Zelensky says Ukraine is not in debt to the U.S. So on Sunday, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky pushed back on the terms of the rare earth minerals deal that the Trump administration wants him to sign, insisting Ukraine was not in debt to the U.S. So President Trump has previously said that he wants a deal with Ukraine that would give the U.S. access to about $500 billion in Ukrainian rare earth minerals and other natural resources. Zelensky told reporters, quote, "Let's first clarify the $500 billion figure. I know that we had $100 billion in U.S. aid provided to Ukraine, and that's a fact, but I'm not going to acknowledge $500 billion, regardless of what anyone says, with all due respect to our partners, end quote. The Ukrainian leader also said he was not prepared to pay back the $100 billion because President Biden and Congress agreed to provide the aid as grants, not loans that would be paid back. A very small portion of some of the budget aid that was passed last year was in the form of a loan, but it had this little condition that the president could forgive the loan, and Biden did that before he left office. I think there's still a portion of it that the new administration could collect, but it's just like a few billion out of all the money that the U.S. has given Ukraine. But Zelensky's saying, nope, we don't owe you anything. He said, quote, I made agreements with Biden and with U.S. Congress. I'm grateful to Congress. It was about grant support, and a grant is not a debt. We don't have to repay a debt, so it's not about the figure. It's about the fact that we do not recognize it as debt, end quote. So Zelensky also said that he's willing to reach a new deal with the U.S. that would involve the U.S. getting resources in exchange for continued support, basically saying going forward, we could work out a deal with some kind of loan, or the U.S. getting minerals and resources in exchange for future aid. But this is, I'm sure these comments from Zelensky are going to anger Trump. We might see Trump go after him again on Monday. I wouldn't be surprised. Because what Mike Waltz said was basically Zelensky did a few things that really got under Trump's skin. And one of them was refusing to sign the deal that Besant, the Treasury Secretary, brought to him in Kiev. And, as far as we understand the details of the deal, it would have handed the U.S. 50% of the rights to Ukraine's natural resources, basically. And they're just trying to get Zelensky to sign it. He said no, and now he's saying this. So I'm sure he's going to, we might see a response from Trump to this. And also, Zelensky appeared to be discussing Trump calling him a dictator because of no elections. And he said that he was willing to resign if Ukraine could get NATO membership. Which, of course, that's just not the U.S. has already ruled out NATO membership for Ukraine. That's a complete non-starter for Russia. So, but Zelensky said, quote, if it guarantees peace for Ukraine, if you really need me to resign, I am ready. I can exchange it for NATO, end quote. All right, so the next one here, the U.S. and Russia to hold more talks this week on improving ties. So Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov said Sunday that the U.S. and Russian officials will hold another round of talks on improving relations sometimes over the next week. Ryabkov said, quote, we are open to contacts with the American side, in particular to address the irritants in bilateral relations. We expect real progress when the meeting scheduled for the end of the coming week takes place, end quote. So we don't know who exactly is going to be involved in these talks, but during the talks that were at a very high level in Saudi Arabia, they agreed to improve relations, continue the dialogue. Ryabkov said that there are now quite a lot of contacts between the U.S. and Russia. And Trump and Putin are expected to meet at some point. We don't know when, but it still remains unclear what kind of deal could be reached here to end the war in Ukraine. And in the meantime, the fighting continues very heavy along the front lines. Russia is launching very heavy bombardments of Ukraine. Ukraine said on Sunday that Russia fired 267 drones into Ukraine overnight. They said that was a record number. You see Ukrainian drone attacks inside of Russia. So lots of people still dying and getting hurt in this war. All right, so the next one here, Israel carries out strikes against South Lebanon. So this one's from Jason Ditz. So there was the big funeral for Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah, who was killed in September by an Israeli airstrike in Beirut. And Israeli warplanes flew over the funeral. And, they did this essentially to try to terrorize and scare the people at the funeral, the people in Beirut. And the Israeli military has no shame, and they even put out this picture of these Israeli warplanes flying over Beirut, the city of millions of people. But there was also Israeli airstrikes. Sorry, I'm scrolling all over the place here. So at least 7 Israeli airstrikes were reported on Sunday in southern Lebanon, mostly in the south, but also in the east along the Lebanon-Syria border. Casualty figures are still coming in, though a Syrian girl was reported among the injured in the airstrikes in the Nabatea Governorate. 5 other strikes were centered around the south, with a 7th strike reported near Hermel and Ibeka Hermel Governorate along the Syrian border. So as far as we know, the casualties aren't clear, just that one young girl was injured. But Israel continues to occupy these 5 posts in southern Lebanon. The Nasrallah's funeral was very big, and we're seeing Hezbollah and the Lebanese government saying Israel must end its occupation. So there's always the chance of the Israeli troops continuing to occupy Lebanon, coming under attack. All right, so the next one here. Yves Engler is being charged for pro-Palestine posts. So this is a really outrageous story that's not getting any attention, really, at least the attention that it deserves. So Yves Engler, very prolific writer who we've published at antiwar.com. I think Eric did the count. Yeah, Engler has written 65 articles that have appeared at antiwar.com. He's the author of 13 books. And he's arrested in Canada. He's a Canadian, and he was arrested over his social media posts, his pro-Palestinian social media posts. Essentially what he was doing, there were some pro-Israel activists and he would reply to her post and say, you're a genocide supporter or whatever. And he got arrested for harassment for those posts. And I mean, it's just completely outrageous. This is social media. This is Twitter. This is X. If you're putting stuff out there, people have the right to reply to it. It's kind of the whole point. And if you don't like it, what they're saying, you could block them. There's actually ways to do that. But he got arrested for this. And before he was arrested, he was called by the police, and they told him what was going to happen in the situation. So he's a writer. He wrote up a post about it. He posted it on social media. We published it at antiwar.com. He published it on his website, basically saying what was going to happen. And then the police said, "Oh, you're harassing us now." And they told him to take it down, or he's going to get more charges. And of course, he didn't take it down. So they're charging him more, essentially saying he's harassing the police. And again, it's just completely outrageous that this is happening in Canada, in a Western country. And again, the media reports of it in Canadian media, like the mainstream, are really horrible, basically saying, "Oh yeah, he's harassing the police." It's just completely outrageous. So if you're not familiar with Yves Engler's work, go check it out. Go check out his website, his social media, see if there's ways you could support him through this. We're definitely going to keep an eye on this case. All right, so the last story here, Germany's Merz vows to achieve independence from the U.S. So this is interesting. Friedrich Merz, the German politician who is expected to be the next chancellor following Sunday's elections, vowed that he would work to make Europe independent of the U.S. and suggested that NATO may need to be replaced. So the elections on Sunday in Germany, Merz's party, the CDU-CSU party, which is a merger of two conservative center-right factions, won, and he is expected to be the chancellor if he could put a government together. So after it was clear that his party won, he put out this statement, or he went on TV and started talking, and he said, quote, "My absolute priority will be to strengthen Europe as quickly as possible so that step by step we can really achieve independence from the USA. I never thought I would have to say something like this on a television program, but after Donald Trump's statements last week at the latest, it is clear that the Americans, at least this part of the Americans, this administration, are largely indifferent to the fate of Europe," end quote. So discussing NATO, Merz said, quote, "I am very curious to see how we are heading toward the NATO summit at the end of June, whether we will still be talking about NATO in its current form or whether we will have to establish an independent European defense capability much more quickly," end quote. So on Friday, Merz said that Berlin, so this is a couple days before the election, he said Berlin should reconsider NATO's nuclear sharing program, under which there are U.S. nuclear weapons stored in 5 European countries, including Germany. Merz suggested working on a similar arrangement with the UK and France, Europe's only nuclear-armed states. So while Merz, he's being critical of the U.S. in his comments, I wouldn't be surprised if President Trump is happy about this, welcomes what he's saying, because Trump's whole thing, the message that they've been sending to Europe, Hegseth, J.D. Vance, is that you guys have to start paying for your own military. You shouldn't be so reliant on us. You know, they were essentially saying troop reductions are potentially on the table. And, so this is essentially what Trump is saying that he wants. He's not saying that, the U.S. should quit NATO and everything. I wish he was saying that. But, this is a step in that direction if Europe becomes more kind of just independent militarily from the U.S. So again, Merz's party is a merger of two center-right conservative parties, the Christian Democratic Union, which is his party originally, and the Christian Social Union. So they won. Germany's Alternative for Germany, the AfD, which is considered far right, they came in second in the election, receiving about double the support that it did in the last vote. Merz has said that he would not work with the AfD, which means he's going to have to form a government with the Social Democrats. That's Olaf Scholz's party, the current chancellor, who is now going to be stepping down. So it's not exactly clear how he's going to form a government, but I think he is going to be the one who ends up being the chancellor. And he also criticized Elon Musk for publicly expressing support for the AfD before the election. So Merz said, quote, "I have absolutely no illusions about what is happening from America. Just look at the recent interventions in the German election campaign by Mr. Elon Musk. That is a unique event. The interventions from Washington were no less dramatic and drastic and ultimately outrageous than the interventions we have seen from Moscow. We are under such massive pressure from the two sides that my absolute priority now really is to create unity in Europe." So he's comparing the U.S. to Russia. And it's something I didn't really think of until I read this, that Musk is kind of part of the government now, I guess. So, it is like the U.S. government intervention, because he's always talking about other countries' elections and being very critical of foreign governments. So in a way now it is, the U.S. government intervention, these things that he's doing. And he's very, of course, influential with his he has something like 220 million followers on X. It's just a way I didn't really think of it before, even though, he is meeting with, obviously advising Trump and with Doge and everything. I just didn't think of the way, other countries are probably perceiving him now as a mouthpiece of the U.S. government. I didn't think of it that way. All right, so that is it for the news for today. Please go check out our viewpoints. One from Ted Snyder, Trump versus Zelensky, fact-checking the new Ukraine war. One from Scott Horton, should we celebrate the demise of USAID and the NED? It's an excerpt from his book, Provoked, about these organizations' roles in the coup in Ukraine. One from Brandon Buck, from one endless war to another, Trump's new military frontier in Mexico. One from Eugene Chudnovsky, what are realistic expectations for Ukraine peace? And one from James Carden, out of Europe to save Europe. So go check all of that out. You could always support this show by liking, subscribing, commenting. Follow us on social media on X. Follow my account there too. Also, antiwar.com is on Instagram and TikTok. Lots of content over there. Anyway, that is it for me for today. I hope everyone had a good weekend. I will be back tomorrow with some more news. Thanks for listening.